The big word for this is social stratification. What is social stratification?
Social stratification is basically how society is structured and organized. It can, the ways in which hierarchy and status gets differentiated and marked. So you can have social stratification based on socioeconomic status, so thinking about education and occupations and income and wealth. It can also be organized around racial differences and ethnic differences, just different ways in which we mark hierarchy and social status in society.
Why did you decide to focus on children?
I've had a long-standing interest in this. I've done a lot of research really trying to unpack and understand what it is about the experience of poverty that makes a difference in children's lives, in part really motivated by trying to think about if we can understand this, then we can think about ways to address it and mitigate its effects, and even at a policy level, think about what kinds of supports should we be designing and providing for families to kind of ease their economic hardship and burden. And in doing that work many years ago, even going back to my own dissertation, I realized that we're doing a lot of this work, but nobody was really paying attention to how children are making sense of this and the kinds of meaning making that they engage in when they look out into the world and they start learning about who they are, they start learning about who their friends are, they start, just paying attention to how things work in the world. And so it was really motivated by that question of, as adults, we have a lot of ideas and beliefs about our social worlds and how we get to be where we are. But children start to understand this, and we know from a very large literature looking at children's understanding of race and gender that it starts pretty early. We don't have when I started this work, we didn't have as good of a sense of how children are making sense of something as complex as social class. And so that really motivated the work on just getting out there and seeing how children are making sense of this and the kinds of assumptions and associations that they're mostly just inferring from what they see in the world and the kinds of interactions they have with people and others in their world. So
when you're talking about children, they think that children don't pick up on these things. I think in your paper called it social blindness.
People's assumptions that children are economically blind. And we really borrow that from work on racial ethnic identity and racial ethnic awareness work. So there's a notion that sometimes parents engage in what we call colorblind socialization, which is this idea that, we want to really encourage our children to grow up in a world where they are respectful and mindful and accepting of everyone in their environment. And part of how we do that is the thinking that we shouldn't draw attention to our differences. So we shouldn't draw attention to differences based on our race and our ethnic background or our social class background or our gendered background. What we in fact know is these are the things that kids pick up on. They notice differences in skin color. They notice that some kids have long hair and some kids have shorter hair, that there are different genders. The meaning attributed to that comes later, but there are certain kids are not racially blind or economically blind and things like that. But sometimes I think as adults, we think if we don't draw attention to it, then maybe kids won't think that it's important. And in fact, what we know is it's the opposite. The kids are already engaging in this, and they pick up a lot of their cues from the world around them. And so if they pick up on the fact that this is something that adults don't like talking about it, I'm noticing these differences, but the adults in my world don't seem to want to have these conversations, then it's more likely to then have kids think that these are taboo subjects. So in fact, there's a sweet spot and a middle ground, which is to both honor and acknowledge that we do live in a vastly diverse world. Children are just naturally curious and they are going to make these observations. It's what they do. Piaget always talked about children as being little scientists. And I think our task as adults is to help them make meaning of this and help them sort out what is a meaningful, relevant difference, and why is that important, and what are ways that we can be different, but ultimately we're really kind of very similar in important ways as well. So
tell me about your study.
this study was really, there's some really great work that shows that even as adults, we are not good at understanding the level of economic inequality that currently exists in the US and many other countries around the world. And when we ask adults about it, first of all, they completely underestimate how unequal American society is at this point in time, but they also aspire and want and think that we should have a society that's more equal, less unequal. And there's been a little bit of that work done with adolescents, and so as part of this study we were curious, because we've done a lot of work, we know children are thinking about issues like wealth and poverty at this early age. We just wanted to get a sense of, do they also think about it in terms of, is it fair or not fair that some families have a lot more access to resources, a lot more access to money, whereas others don't? And then what should we do about it? So there's also good work that shows that young children especially are very much motivated by a desire to do good, by a desire to make sure that things are equal, and when they get a little bit older, that things are equitable, and that if someone doesn't have as much, that we should correct that and do something. But nobody's really done the assessment of inequality work with really young kids, and so that was our study, was to think about, one, just are children noticing these differences? Do they notice these kinds of differences in their own neighborhoods and communities that some people seem to have more or less? And then what are their assumptions and presumptions around, is that fair? If not, why and why not? And if it isn't fair, then what would be more fair, or what are some ways to make it more fair? And so that's what we asked.
What age groups?
These were 5 through 8-year-old children, so pretty young.
What did you find?
What we found is that children already have some ideas. We developed a task where children got to see lots of different configurations of the numbers of rich, poor, and middle class families in their neighborhood, and we asked them to kind of tell us what they thought their neighborhood looked like. And then we asked them, do they think that that's fair? Yes or no? And if it's not fair, what would be more fair? And essentially what we found is that the majority of our kids identified a neighborhood composition where most of the families were middle class, and that there were a few families that were poor and a few families that were rich, and we had some variations around that. So that's important, the fact that they're already gravitating towards thinking that most people are somewhere in between, in the middle. When we also asked, is that fair, if they had rated it as kind of a middle class concentration, they were more likely to say yes, because it means that some people don't have a lot while other people have very little, that everybody has enough for what they need to survive and meet their needs. In cases where children picked one of the more extreme cases, we would ask why not and what would be more fair, and they said it's not fair because it means that those with more resources should be doing more to help those that have fewer, and that what would be more fair is if everybody actually had enough to meet their family's needs. That it wasn't fair that some people had so much that they had an excess, whereas other people were really struggling and didn't have enough for basic things like food and shelter and stuff. So I think what it speaks to is this, as I said, that even very early on, children are aware of these differences in a way that makes sense developmentally for them. It's often very concrete in terms of, do we have enough to meet our family's needs? But they do start to recognize that as a society, not everybody is equal. And when you ask, so how do we correct that, or how do we make it so that it's more fair? Their response is that we really should be thinking about ways to help those that need a little bit more assistance, and that often it's, we should help them by maybe having those that have more give more to those that have less, which I think gives us an inkling into how young children are just thinking about issues of resource distribution and fairness and equality.
What do you do with this information?
I think the one thing is to just highlight that young children are not economically blind, that they are sensitive to this. They are, like I said, making these observations in their environment, and they're drawing conclusions based on what they observe. I think the other piece of it is the work that we do around, so how do we help children understand this in ways that make sense for 5 and 8-year-olds? So it's the work that we do with teachers. It's the work that we do with just sharing resources about, even as a parent, how might you engage in some of these kinds of conversations with young children. I think part of our messaging is don't ignore them. When they have questions, they're questions of curiosity. And oftentimes we are less comfortable talking about these things, and we are less confident in how to have these conversations with young children. So I think part of it is like, how do we even provide supports to the adults that children interact with to help them have those conversations and teach them along the way.